Welcome to Lerwick, the capital of Shetland, and the northernmost major town in Scotland, and indeed the entirety of the United Kingdom. Home to a tightly knit population of some 7,000 people, Lerwick is a relative metropolis on these windswept isles. And on this walk around the centre of Lerwick on a typically cloudy Shetland afternoon, we'll discover this town's endlessly captivating history. We'll venture inside the mighty Fort Charlotte, a 17th century fortress built to defend Shetland from Dutch attacks. We'll stroll past the historic Market Cross and along Commercial Street, Lerwick's narrow main street. And we'll explore some mesmerising stretches of this town's waterfront, where iconic, centuries-old houses bear the brunt of the waves, while memories of Shetland's proud Scandinavian heritage linger just offshore. All of that, and so much more, is to come over the next half hour, as we explore the sights and sounds of Shetland's enthralling capital. But we begin our walk on the Esplanade, looking towards the town centre as it wraps around Lerwick's busy harbour. Peppered with fishing boats, sailing boats, and even the odd cruise ship, the harbour here is the main gateway in and out of Shetland, and it has been for around 400 years, when major fishing fleets began using the harbour here as their base in the plentiful waters of the North Sea. Now, if you visit Shetland by sea today, whether on the ferry from Aberdeen or Orkney, or indeed on a cruise ship exploring Scotland's spectacular Northern Isles, then you'll almost certainly be making landfall here in Lerwick. And one of the first major landmarks to greet you on the seafront here is also one of the oldest in the whole town. This fetching orange building is the Old Tolbooth, and it was built more than 250 years ago in 1770. Back then, it was the headquarters of Lerwick's local government, where the council met, court sessions were held, and where local criminals were locked up, inside a few dingy jail cells. Today though, the Old Tolbooth has been nicely renovated inside, and now it serves as the home of Lerwick's main lifeboat station, standing proud on the waterfront as it overlooks the harbour, which for so many years has been a crucial lifeline for this remote North Sea settlement. As we mentioned, Lerwick is the most northerly major town in the whole of the UK, and if we take a look at a map, we can see just how far north this town is. Situated on Shetland's mainland, Lerwick lies roughly 300 miles north of the Scottish capital of Edinburgh, and about 600 miles north of London, all the way down in England. In truth, here in Lerwick, we're actually closer to the Norwegian city of Bergen than we are to Edinburgh. And that geography is a big part of why Lerwick, and Shetland as a whole, are unlike anywhere else in the UK. Because for most of history, Shetland wasn't even part of Scotland, or Britain, at all. As we make our way around the Old Tolbooth onto Commercial Street, Shetland possesses a particularly proud Nordic heritage. Because for more than 600 years, from the 9th century until the 15th century, these islands were ruled by the Norse, the Vikings, who came here from across the sea in Scandinavia. The Vikings initially colonised Shetland to make use of its farmland, its fishing stocks, and other natural resources, but they left an indelible impact on these islands that lasted for centuries beyond. Looking out to sea here, we can see a small boat floating on the waters of Lerwick's harbour. It's known as the Dim Riv, and it was built about 40 years ago as a replica of a typical Viking longship, the kind that would have carried settlers across the North Sea from Norway more than 1,000 years ago. The view of the boat from the shore is a famous image of Shetland's capital, but it's not the only iconic landmark that you'll find in this part of town. Just here, we're passing by a historic house, which over the years has risen to become perhaps the most famous in all of Lerwick. Its address is number 20 Commercial Street, but it's best known as the Lodberry, and it was built around 250 years ago in the late 18th century. Originally built as a seafront warehouse, the Lodberry was deliberately designed to jut out into the water, so that boats could dock alongside and easily load or offload goods. Indeed, the word Lodberry comes from the Old Norse Lodberg, literally translating as a flat stone, which came to mean loading rock. Now, once upon a time, Lerwick's waterfront was lined with many more Lodberries, just like this one, although the town's shoreline was largely redeveloped in the 1880s, leaving just a few still standing. But today, this Lodberry in particular is especially well known around the country, and beyond, to viewers of the hit TV drama Shetland, where it plays the part of Detective Jimmy Perez's house. It's a great show which has played a part in drawing tourists to Shetland ever since it began airing back in 2013, which was around the same time when this road sign was first graced with an unusual mascot. Nobody knows exactly why snails started appearing on Lerwick's road signs, but today you'll actually see them in a number of places around town, and it's a trend which has become a little bit of a cult hit among the residents of Lerwick, a town with plenty more similarly intriguing mysteries to be uncovered as you walk its streets. For instance, here we're looking out across Bain's beach, towards another of Lerwick's Lodberries. But this small stretch of sand actually lies above wider deposits of mud and clay, which lend their name to the town that we're exploring right now. Lerwick, like so many other places in Shetland, derives its name from Old Norse, the historic name Lerwick literally meaning the Bay of Clay. Now, over time, this Norse name evolved into the Scots Lerwick, although you'll also hear the name regularly pronounced as Lerwick. Both are commonly said across Shetland. However, as Shetland's only major town, Lerwick is often simply referred to as Datun, the town. And it's in Datun that you'll find major bars like the historic Queen's Hotel, which we're passing here. Opened back in 1868 in what was once the home of the wealthy Hay family, during Lerwick's early years as Shetland's capital. That's right, because while Lerwick may be home to centuries upon centuries of history, the truth is that it hasn't actually been Shetland's capital for all that long. For most of history, the capital of Shetland was located about 6 miles from here, at Scalawa, today a small coastal village of about 1,000 people. But by the 16th and 17th centuries, Lerwick here had become a popular base for North Sea fishermen, particularly those who'd sailed all the way up from the Netherlands. And so there emerged a burgeoning onshore community of locals who set up an array of businesses to trade with or simply cater to the fishermen. By the early 19th century, Lerwick had come to be considered as Shetland's modern capital, eventually home to important institutions like the post office. Originally housed in the Old Tolbooth, Lerwick's post office gained this dedicated home in 1910. Just a couple of years before it starred in one of the most unusual incidents in this town's history. Just months after the First World War had broken out in 1914, the entire staff of Lerwick's post office here, some 40 locals, were arrested, much to their surprise. Marched around the corner by armed soldiers to the county jail, they were locked up, without even being told what they'd been arrested for. After 6 days in jail, suddenly, and again without explanation, they were released. Known locally as the Post Office Affair, the incident caused outrage among Shetlanders, who demanded answers, but no official inquiries nor apologies were ever given. In fact, it turns out that the British government had suspected Lerwick's post office staff of tampering with mail passing through on its way across the Atlantic from America, although there were of course no grounds to these suspicions whatsoever. Fortunately, feelings have cooled in the century since, and that allows us to turn our attention to Lerwick's humble market cross here, which stands at the heart of the town. Now, a market cross has stood at this spot in some shape or other since at least 1838, and today it also features a handy barometer and thermometer for public use, best for those setting out to sea on small boats to check for any bad weather on the horizon. But once upon a time, as the name suggests, the market cross was surrounded by market stalls, selling all kinds of goods. Today, though, it's better known as the venue for some of Lerwick's main public events throughout the year. A Christmas tree stands beside the cross during the town's festive celebrations, while every year on the last Tuesday in January, this is the centrepiece of Lerwick's world-famous celebration of Up Helly Ah. During a part of the year when Lerwick is shrouded in darkness for more than 2/3 of each day, the town's streets burst into life as a huge procession of people bearing torches leads a full-size replica Viking longship through Lerwick, on its way to being ceremonially burned in a park just a few streets away from here. Now, despite being inspired by Shetland's proud Viking heritage, which dates back more than 1,000 years, the Up Helly Ah festivities are actually deceivingly modern. The first torch procession was only held in 1881, at a time when this town was undergoing great changes. Just here, we're passing by Lerwick's monumental branch of the Bank of Scotland, which was built back in 1904 on the town's main street here, which is officially named Commercial Street, but to most locals it's known simply as The Street. It's along this narrow thoroughfare that you'll find most of Lerwick's shops, cafes, bars and such, and most are housed in buildings which date from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the town centre here was widely redeveloped as its population was growing on the back of thriving sea trade and the ever-present fishing industry. Before these changes, Lerwick's compact old town wrapped tightly around the harbour, with a dense collection of houses in this area. And while they are now long gone, we can still see traces of the old town as we stroll along Commercial Street. Branching off the street are a number of narrow lanes, called closes, or closses locally. This, for instance, was once known as Tait's Closs, taking its name from a resident called Tait who once lived along its path. Now, it was renamed to Reform Lane in the 1830s, in celebration of the Great Reform Act of 1832. But the Closs's original name is a vivid reminder of exactly what central Lerwick was like before it was widely redeveloped in the Victorian era. As we mentioned, the harbour was the centre of all attention here in Lerwick. In fact, many people's houses and Lodberries had doors which opened directly out into the water, allowing for easy access to their boats. For this reason, some even dubbed Old Lerwick as a Venice of the North, a place where life on the water was more important than life on land. And it wasn't just local Shetlanders who were going about their business here. From the late 16th century onwards, people were coming to Lerwick from all over Europe. The first people to establish an international presence here were the Dutch. Fishing fleets would sail up from the Netherlands every summer to take advantage of the vast shoals of herring swimming off Shetland shores. Lerwick, with its natural harbour, was a useful base for Dutch fishermen to evade the roughest of the North Sea waves, and over the years they began sailing to this place in truly astonishing numbers. It's said that during one particularly lively fishing season in the early 17th century, more than 22,000 Dutch fishermen came to Lerwick. That's more than 3 times this town's entire population in the 21st century. Indeed, as we admire the beautiful architecture of the Grand Hotel here, built back in 1886, Dutch fishermen played an important part in Lerwick's rise to becoming Shetland's largest and most important settlement. Trading with and catering to Dutch fishermen, people moved into Lerwick in great numbers, and by the end of the 17th century there were about 700 people living here. Yet as the scale of fishing grew ever larger as the Industrial Revolution rolled around, local growth became unstoppable. By the mid-19th century, Lerwick's population had risen to more than 3,000, in the process overtaking Scalloa as Shetland's unquestionable capital. These developments brought great wealth to the burgeoning town, and it was put to good use in redeveloping Lerwick for the modern era. With so many more people living here, all desperate to be as close to the prosperous harbour as possible, The old town of Closses and Lodberries had to make way. And so throughout the rest of the 19th century, Lerwick was transformed into the shape that we know today, with grand new Victorian buildings lining Commercial Street, the harbour expanded, and ever more houses built on what were once the town's outskirts, now a network of suburban streets which spread westwards for about half a mile inland. Certainly, Lerwick today looks very different to how it did to Viking settlers and Dutch fishermen in times past, but there are still a few pre-Victorian landmarks to be found on the town's streets, the most impressive of which can be found standing high above the rocks to our left. A prominent Lerwick landmark for around 250 years, this is Fort Charlotte, a grand harbour fortress which was built back in 1781. Now that may sound fairly old, but the truth is that this Fort Charlotte is actually the third to have been built. In fact, a fortress was first constructed to defend Lerwick nearly 400 years ago, and well over a century before the fort that we see today came into existence. But to understand the story of Fort Charlotte, we need to go back to the events of the mid-17th century. At the time, Lerwick may have been booming through trade with the Dutch, but more widely, relations between Britain and the Netherlands were reaching an all-time low. A long-running series of trade disputes in the English Channel and the North Sea eventually led to war in 1652, and in order to defend against Dutch attacks, Oliver Cromwell, at the time the Lord Protector of England and Scotland, ordered the construction of a number of forts along Britain's east coast. But as we make our way into Fort Charlotte now, there remains no trace of that Cromwellian fort of the 1650s. The reason? It was rebuilt on a larger scale in 1665 as the warring nations geared up for the Second Anglo-Dutch War. But shortly afterwards, in 1673, as the Third Anglo-Dutch War raged, the Dutch fleet sailed all the way up to Shetland, sacked Lerwick, and destroyed the fort which once stood here. For more than 100 years then, Fort Charlotte lay in ruin as the town of Lerwick continued to grow around it, and it was only in 1781 that it was rebuilt into the form we see today, offering commanding views of the harbour and the surrounding townscape from this vantage point. Indeed, from this point, we can look up to another of Lerwick's most prominent landmarks of all, the Town Hall, atop which we can see the flag of Shetland proudly fluttering in the wind. The Town Hall over there was built back in 1883, during that sweeping period of redevelopment in Lerwick, and it served as the meeting place for the local government, the Old Tolbooth by the harbour having become long outdated. But what of Fort Charlotte here? Why was it rebuilt after more than a century of ruin? And how come it survived all of the changes of the 19th century to still remain standing today? Well, the main spark for reconstruction was actually the outbreak of war across the pond in the United States. The American Revolutionary War may have been mostly based on the North American continent, but it had a far-reaching impact, particularly after both France and Spain, Britain's enemies at the time, entered the conflict on the side of George Washington's Patriot forces. With much of the Royal Navy and other British forces engaged in America, there were real fears that France and Spain could seize the opportunity and launch an invasion of Britain itself. And so huge new defences were built all over the country to guard against that possibility, including here in Lerwick. Now, as a fort had already stood here, in a prime position overlooking the vitally important harbour, it made sense to simply reconstruct the fort with more modern defences, and it was named Fort Charlotte, after the wife of then King George III. Ultimately though, Fort Charlotte never saw action, but it did remain in use during the Napoleonic Wars a couple of decades later, as the home of a garrison of soldiers, who were stationed here to protect Lerwick in the event of any further French attacks. These barracks housed soldiers at Fort Charlotte for 18 years, until they disbanded in 1815. But today, as we can see, these buildings play home to Lerwick's own division of the Army Reserve, formerly known as the Territorial Army. This is actually the only Army Reserve base that you'll find north of the Firth of Forth, and it's one of just 3 pre-Victorian forts in Scotland which still hold an active military role, the others being Fort George near Inverness and Edinburgh Castle. But for a period after the Napoleonic Wars, there was actually no military presence in Fort Charlotte at all. After the garrison disbanded, the buildings were turned into apartments, and so the only military feature that was left were 12 cannons, which looked out towards the sea. Now, unfortunately, one night a band of local youths climbed up the fort walls and began firing the cannons into the water, perhaps seeing how far they could get the cannon balls to fly, towards the island of Bressay, the rather green landmass that we can see directly opposite Lerwick. For that reason, this stretch of water is known as the Bressay Sound, a naturally sheltered part of the North Sea which was crucial to Lerwick's development, and which is now crossed by all manner of ferries and fishing boats every day. Although we can see the seafront road passing between the foot of the fort here and the waters of the Sound, once upon a time the waves would have actually lapped right up to the walls of the fort itself. As Lerwick's population grew in the 19th century, land reclamation created more space for people to live and work around the harbour, pushing the sea a few dozen yards back from where it once was. During that same period, Fort Charlotte here went into use as the new home of the town's jail and courthouse, and it later became a customs house and coastguard station before it eventually regained a military role at the beginning of the 20th century. And thankfully, through all of that, the fort has survived largely unchanged. In fact, just here we find the original magazine, the place where the fort's vast supply of gunpowder was once stored, behind thick stone walls which were designed to cushion the force of the blast should the whole store accidentally ignite. Fortunately, it never did, and the magazine is one of many excellently preserved points of interest inside this historic fort. But sadly, it's time for us to make our way out of Fort Charlotte and back onto the streets of Lerwick, because there's more for us to see in Shetland's captivating capital. Lerwick may be full of history at every turn, but there is of course much more to Shetland's story than can be seen in this one town. Because for centuries before Dutch fishermen first arrived into the Bressay Sound, these islands were still busy with activity elsewhere. As we mentioned earlier, for much of history Shetland wasn't part of Scotland at all. Rather, it was ruled from Scandinavia, after having been settled by the Vikings in the 9th century. Now, the Vikings weren't actually the first people to settle in Shetland. For thousands of years before their arrival, these islands were inhabited by a collection of prehistoric people groups, including Pictish peoples who also lived in mainland Scotland. Indeed, Shetland is probably one of the best places in Britain today where you can get up close and personal with countless prehistoric landmarks, built thousands and thousands of years ago. Just on the edge of Lerwick, for example, about a 20-minute walk from where we are now, you'll find the beautiful Broch of Clickamin, a grand stone tower that was built more than 2,000 years ago, and which remains incredibly preserved today. Further afield are the likes of the prehistoric settlement at Jarlshof, home to building remains from more than 4,000 years ago, and among the windswept wilderness of Shetland's roughly 100 islands, plenty more enchanting ruins to be discovered. After the prehistoric era, the Viking Age reshaped Shetland. The settlers initially came here to make use of the island's natural resources, but later they incorporated the region as an integral part of the Kingdom of Norway, which at its peak also covered parts of modern-day Sweden, Finland and Russia, as well as Greenland, Iceland, the Faroe Islands, Orkney, the Outer Hebrides, the Isle of Man, and even parts of mainland Scotland, Wales and Ireland. The Norwegian realm was a vast maritime empire at its greatest extent around the time of the 13th century, but over the years its power waned and it was forced to cede territories. Shetland, together with Orkney, remained under Scandinavian rule until 1472, when the islands were incorporated into Scotland, to make up for the fact that the family of Princess Margaret of Denmark had failed to pay the money included in a dowry to James III of Scotland, to whom she had been married. Now, this rather transactional change of sovereignty initially had little effect on the day-to-day lives of Shetlanders. But as the island's economic importance grew, the imposition of Scottish rule became ever greater. As time went on, Shetland's traditional Norse legal systems were replaced with Scottish law. And when Scotland and England joined to form the Kingdom of Great Britain, the new central government in London sought to control the trade passing between Lerwick and mainland Europe more tightly. Nowadays, much of the day-to-day administration is carried out by the Shetland Islands Council, this modern building serving as one of the main council offices in Lerwick, while Shetland as a whole, with its population of roughly 23,000 people, is also represented by a single Member of Parliament down in Westminster, shared as a single constituency with Orkney. Despite its distance from the centre of power in London, Shetland is very much an integral part of the United Kingdom, and an excellent example of the wide variety of landscapes and cultures to be found in the modern nation. Just here, we're passing by the rather impressive Mareel building, opened back in 2012 as Lerwick's cinema and events hall. In fact, this building is home to the UK's most northerly cinema of all, as well as an auditorium which regularly plays host to cultural events celebrating Shetland's rich heritage. The venue's name, Mareel, is a local word which refers to a phenomenon also known as the Milky Sea, when the sea appears to glow brightly, likely caused by tiny creatures beneath the surface. Often seen on autumn nights in the waters off Lerwick, the word Mareel literally means sea fire, and it's an example of a local word that you won't find anywhere else in Scotland, because it's actually derived from a local language that the people of Shetland once spoke. For many centuries, the people of Shetland, as well as Orkney, spoke a language called Norn, closely related to the Faroese and Icelandic languages, and much unlike the Gaelic or Scots tongues spoken in mainland Scotland. Now, sadly, use of the Norn language began to decline after Shetland was absorbed into Scotland, and it became extinct altogether in the mid-19th century, as British influence came to dominate these islands. For instance, just here we find ourselves at Hayes Dock, the oldest remaining part of Lerwick's historic waterfront, and an example of what the town's harbour would have looked like before its redevelopment. Built in the 1820s, the dock's name comes from the Hay family, who originally came from North Lanarkshire to settle in Shetland, and who you might remember were the wealthy family of merchants that once lived next door to the Old Tolbooth, in what is now the Queen's Hotel. The Hays were involved in building this dock, which soon became one of the busiest spots in industrial-era Lerwick, with everything from shipyards, large warehouses, mills and more springing up around it, in order to cater to the busy waterborne trade arriving into Lerwick. Today the old dock is much quieter, home instead to monuments like this propeller blade, which was salvaged from the sunken HMS Oceanic, a former cruise liner which sank off Shetland's coast in 1914, when it was being used by the Royal Navy as a warship. Just around the corner here, meanwhile, is an unusual set of speakers, which play recordings of life in Shetland from throughout the years. But strangely, the clips that they play are dependent on the weather, specifically the wind. When the wind speed is low, not all too common an occurrence in Shetland, the clips played by these speakers get longer. But when the wind is blowing more fiercely, then the clips become shorter. It's an unusual art piece which speaks to the way in which Shetland's weather is so closely tied in with everyday life. But to learn everything you need to know about life in Shetland, and to get out of the wind for a bit, there's no better place to go than the building we find here, the Shetland Museum and Archives. Opened back in 2007, this expansive museum is a brilliant cradle of knowledge and culture in the heart of these riveting isles. Inside you'll find an array of dynamic and enthralling exhibitions detailing the stories of how different people groups came to Shetland and settled here, coping with the changing elements through the centuries. There are also plenty of relics from prehistoric times all the way up to the modern day, and there's nowhere else in the world where you can get such an in-depth look at everything Shetland has to offer, all under one roof. Even better, the museum is entirely free to enter, making it a must-visit for anyone on a day out in Lerwick, a town which, as we've seen, has so much to offer, but is of course just one part of what makes the Shetland Islands such an amazing destination. Because although we've explored the story of Lerwick in depth on this half-hour walk through town, this is just one small corner of a vast and varied island chain, where you'll find some of the UK's most stunning natural scenery, with mesmerising moorlands, immense sea cliffs, mighty voes, and local wildlife including puffins and nearly 300,000 sheep, all starring alongside a real wealth of history, with ruined castles, historic villages, and prehistoric monuments to be found wherever you venture. So, while it's here that we've sadly reached the end of our walk in Lerwick, I hope that you've enjoyed this as a taster of all that Shetland has to offer. And if you are thinking of making a trip up to these most northerly isles for yourself, then make sure not just to explore this captivating town, but to get out there and enjoy a vast natural wilderness like no other in the country today. Thank you so much for watching.